Today, we're talking about something that's part of almost every modern plate, but rarely gets discussed at dinner time: pesticides.
Pesticides are poisons. They are designed to kill living organisms, and that is exactly what they do. You can get an apple with 14 different pesticides on it. What are they doing to us? We don't know.
What about this fruit washing business? Gives me a headache. What do you think? Does it actually work?
If we didn't have insect pollination, we'd have a very brown, very dull, boring diet.
So I think now is a good time to segue into what we can actually do.
Welcome to In Good Taste, the podcast on food matters for food lovers, with me, Malika Basu, writer, commentator, and advisor. Today, we're talking about something that's part of almost every modern plate, but rarely gets discussed at dinner time: pesticides. These chemicals are used widely to protect the crops we rely on. But how safe are they really? What do we actually need to worry about? And is avoiding them even realistic? To help us make sense of it without any fear-mongering, I'm joined today by Nick Moll from the Pesticide Action Network, a long-time campaigner and expert on pesticides.
So hello, Nick. Thank you very, very much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
At a very basic level, Nick, what are pesticides and why are they so widely used in food production?
A couple of things I think worth clearing up first of all. So when I refer to pesticides, I mean all the sides that are used to kill things. So under the pesticide umbrella come insecticides, which kill insects, herbicides, which kill plants, fungicides, which kill fungus, etc., etc. So all those things fall under the general umbrella of pesticides. Pesticides are poisons. They are designed to kill living organisms, and that is exactly what they do. And in fact, they're the only sort of class of chemicals really that are put out into the environment with the express purpose of killing something. That's their job, and they do it very well. So pesticide use really took off after the Second World War. There was a real need to increase production to feed the population after all those years of food shortages and rationing, etc., and where we hadn't been able to grow things. So pesticides can protect a crop from sort of insects or diseases or weeds that might interfere with their growth and basically increase yields. So the idea was to use them to increase yields, and that was sort of ushered in under what is rather confusingly called the Green Revolution, which has a slightly different connotation these days. So that's why we use pesticides, and we continue to use pesticides because, well, for a number of reasons. I mean, the primary one is there's an awful lot of money to be made from selling pesticides to people. It's a multi-billion pound dollar business that generates a huge amount of income for a very small limited number of global corporations, and many farmers are trapped in this. We've destroyed all a lot of the natural predators, the sort of things that would be used to fight off things. They've been killed because pesticides don't just limit themselves to those things that are perceived to be a problem. They also impact non-target species, and go back to my opening statements. Bees is a great example of that. Nobody set out to kill bees; they were trying to kill some other pest. But unfortunately, pesticides are indiscriminate in what they do, and so they have these knock-on effects.
The Green Revolution is interesting because it was quite global, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
It happened in places like India, China, Mexico, of course, is where it started.
Yeah, and it was this huge drive to increase production and feed the world after all these years of. And we had these chemicals left over that had been sort of developed in the First World War and in the Second World War, and some of them were nerve agents. They were actually used for warfare, and suddenly, let's try these on insects. Let's try these, we'll try these. We've invented them. Let's try them on something else. And so, that's kind of where a lot of the first and early insecticides came from. So, yeah, they don't have a particularly illustrious background. But the first real impact weren't started to be noticed with the use of DDT, and particularly, highlighted by Rachel Carson in a seminal book, which actually you could argue kicked off the real green revolution, which was environmentalism. And that's in her book Silent Spring, where she pointed out that if we carry on using these, at some point we're going to wake up and there will be no birds because we've killed all the insects, or we've thinned their eggshells, and that there's nothing left. And worryingly, we're still discussing even some of the chemicals she talked about, but fighting the same battle. And you could say that we are finally reaching that tipping point, as we are in the midst of a global biodiversity crisis that is also being seen widely in the UK.
I mean, biodiversity I like to describe in layman's terms as chirping birds and buzzing bees. And, we love those things. Like, who doesn't enjoy walks in nature and the great countryside? And, it's tragic, isn't it, the impact that these chemicals have on nature. So could you expand on what's exactly happening with bees?
Well, the thing is, it's not just bees. It's all, it's across the whole food chain. And I very much like that you pointed it out that, biodiversity is this thing. And personally, yes, just enjoy nature, the bees or the birds or whatever, just for the actual, their inherent beauty. But actually, they provide serious and important functions that help support us as a species to live. So pesticides, what are they doing? What aren't they doing? I suppose you could look at it a number of ways. So if you take insecticides, for example, well, the insecticides will kill the insects. Birds that feed on those insects will then have, less to feed on. And actually, we've lost about 70%, not 70, about 50% of our farmland bird species since the 1970s, and that figure keeps going down year on year. But then, of course, there's all the things that rely on the birds for food, etc. The overuse of herbicides is destroying both variety and abundance of wildflowers, which the insects require to function, to live on, and the birds, and so on up the food chain. Our water is being polluted by pesticides that run off into them, which is harming aquatic ecosystems and destroying that, whether it's killing fish or the plants that they live on. The air is polluted by pesticides. So pesticides are everywhere, but all of these things are linked. This is the global web of life which is being interfered with by pesticides. And of course, when it comes to bees and other pollinating insects, well, they provide, they help us grow a wide variety of food. In fact, the more interesting food. If we didn't have insect pollination, we'd have a very brown, very dull, boring diet. And I hate doing this with nature, sort of reducing it to a monetary value. But actually, the pollination services provided by these insects free of charge for us to do would cost hundreds of millions of pounds every year. There are some places in China where they wiped out pretty much all the insects, and they have to pollinate the apple trees by hand. The services that they provide to us, if we lose them, well, the world would be a very different place, and our diets would be very different. Yeah, so this is, that's the impact that pesticides are having.
That's the nature bit for sure. And well, this is a food podcast, of course, and I'm now wondering how these pesticides end up in the food we eat.
Great question. Well, they do. So pesticides are used. Many of them can be quite persistent, so they end up as residues on the food we eat. Pesticides aren't just used to grow our food; they're also used to keep it from rotting, to preserve it, to aid transport. Particularly with things that we don't grow in this country, I think specifically a sort of citrus fruits and other things, but also the out of season strawberries. I mean, A, who wants to eat a strawberry in December? But B, if you are going to import them, then they're probably sprayed with a fungicide to stop them rotting in transport. So they can be on or in. And so many of the pesticides that we use these days are systemic, so they're taken up into the plant, into the fruit or the vegetable or whatever it is. So they become a sort of intrinsic part of that. There is residue testing data done, and we analyse it every year. We publish a thing called the Dirty Dozen based on UK government residue testing figures, so we can let people make a choice about what they're going to eat. But we look at the issue of multiple pesticide residues in fruit and vegetables, and you can get an apple with 14 different pesticides on it. So, yes, it is an issue. Some of these are carcinogenic, potentially endocrine disrupting chemicals, and these health impacts, they're not us saying that. These are descriptions and definitions provided by the people that actually make the pesticides, all the government agencies that regulate them. So they're in our food. They're not in everything equally. So squash generally doesn't have residues in it, but grapefruit, almost every single grapefruit will have something on it. But fruits and vegetables are particularly bad. But also cereals. Recently looked at sort of bread products. 50% of them had glyphosate and other pesticide residues in it because of the wide use of herbicides in the cereal industry.
Before we move on to some of the health aspects, is it a bit futile to think that we can actually do farming without these pesticides? Aren't they just an essential part of modern farming systems?
No, is the very short and very simple answer. They have become that way because they've been pushed on farmers. Multiple bits of research from various countries around the world could show that actually we could dramatically reduce our use of pesticides without impacting on yield whatsoever. But that's not how modern farming works. That's not how industrial farming works. And actually, one thing I didn't mention about pesticides and what they do, without pesticides, we wouldn't have this modern, intensive, industrial monocrop farming because it wouldn't be possible. But it is possible to farm successfully without pesticides, or certainly with a massively reduced level of pesticide inputs. I mean, organic agriculture is perfectly possible. We've got people like the Nature Friendly Farmers Network. One of the problems is this trap. I already mentioned that the systems that would support natural predators have been destroyed over the decades that we've been using heavy inputs of pesticides, for example. And the other issue is farmers themselves. Farmers aren't getting a fair deal from retailers, so them making changes that might result in a very small percentage loss of yield could dramatically affect their income. So farmers don't have the room to make those changes that are possible. They don't get the support from government to make those changes, which is vital in terms of both training but support and payments, etc. And I think lastly, and this might be a bit contentious, they don't get the support from the public either. There is this sort of notion that we must have cheap food, that cheap food is the be-all and end-all of it. Yeah, it's possible to change, but this is a system-wide change. But the farmers reducing their pesticide inputs, but that support, if we want to go further, and to come back to your original question, yes, it is perfectly possible to farm without pesticides or with a massively reduced level of pesticide use.
You raised so many points there, Nick. I mean, one of my bugbears is that people who can afford to spend more money on food don't. It's like we don't prioritize healthy, wholesome food, and we'd rather have holidays and expensive clothes and handbags, which, affordability obviously is a huge issue for lots of people in society. But where that ability exists, we should definitely be reaching for better produce and support producers that are doing the right thing, I suppose, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also tied up in that is the issue of local and seasonal. The point of strawberries in December. Why? Why are we eating strawberries in December? That removes all the joy of eating strawberries in June or July, when they should be eaten, when they are at their best, when they can be brought from just down the road rather than from Peru or Mexico or somewhere like that. So that whole seasonal and local approach again is, which means you're then not actually paying for the transport costs. You're not paying for the use of the pesticides that are put on to transport them. So again, food can be reasonably priced, but if you want something out of season, then you're going to have to pay for more for it, but people don't, and it's the hidden costs as well. So people often say that organic is expensive. Well, it isn't, because organic is paying the full price of production without using all these harmful inputs. If the growers that use pesticides were to pay for all the hidden costs, like cleaning up the water they polluted, or paying for the healthcare because someone has an ongoing long-term disease, or paying to restore farmland bird habitat, if those real costs were put in, then there would be, they'd actually probably be more expensive than organic farming. But of course they're all hidden, and the pesticide companies don't pay those costs, and it gives this if you like, it's a subsidy. It's a hidden subsidy, and it gives this sort of imbalance in food costs. But also, organic doesn't necessarily have to be more expensive. But we'll come on to
No.
this. Come on to this when we talk about the dirty dozen, perhaps.
We will indeed, yes, and cover that in a bit more detail. Before we go into that, you mentioned monocropping. I just want to clarify what that is. So that's just rows and rows of the same crop growing, isn't it?
Exactly. It's those, those miles and miles of corn or miles and miles of wheat or whatever it happens to be, where you've just got one crop and nothing else. There's no diversity. It's basically a biodiversity desert, which doesn't help anybody. I mean, it's easier to grow. It's easier to grow at scale. It's easier to harvest, but actually the impacts from it are awful. And it's not as marked here, but certainly when you go to the US, the middle of the US where they're growing the corn and the wheat, and you've just got mile after mile after mile after of wheat fields, But that's underpinned by pesticide use because you couldn't do it otherwise. And it is the same here as well. So monocultures are bad for biodiversity. And
Noted,
yes.
Nick. Now, health. We've talked about carcinogenic and endocrine disruption.
Endocrine disrupting, yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about that. What are these pesticides doing to our insides, please?
There are two parts to pesticides. So pesticides can have acute impacts on human health. They're most usually felt by the people growing our food, and there are thousands and thousands of farmers, usually in the global south, who are poisoned or die from pesticide exposure and growing food that we import into this country. So there's the acute ones, which are noticeable, all sorts of effects, from streaming, runny eyes to breathing difficulties or death. And then there are the chronic impacts, which is the longer term health impacts. And I suppose the honest answer is, what are they doing to us? We don't know. We don't know. We do know is that pesticide active substances have certain characteristics. So they can be carcinogenic. They can be carcinogenic humans, probable human carcinogens, possible human carcinogens. They could be endocrine disruptors or suspected endocrine disrupting chemicals. They could be neurotoxins or reproductive toxins or a whole range of different things. And as I've already mentioned, this isn't us saying it. This is actually the people that make these things and the government authorities that regulate these things, and also independent researchers that say this is what they are. And so we're ingesting them, but we're not ingesting one at a time. We're ingesting multiple cocktails of these things. The problem is it's almost impossible to attribute, for example, the development of a particular cancer in somebody with a specific exposure incident, because there are so many things that we come into contact with on a daily basis that could have effects. But we do know that these things have these properties. So again, we don't know. Things like endocrine disruption, EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, can have a particular impact on children.
Is that hormones, by the way, Nick?
It is
when
hormones.
You say
It is hormones. So, when children's bodies are developing, these things are all still working. They can interfere dramatically, which could result, and probably does, but again, it's very difficult to pinpoint these things, in long-term lifetime health problems. Now, from cancer, a whole range of different cancers to Parkinson's and, other things that are linked to these. So, the health impacts are there, and they're understood, and the government or the regulatory authorities will say, well, pesticides are really heavily regulated, so there's no risk. Well, that's just they're not. I mean, there are regulations in place, obviously, but those regulations are not robust enough to be put out. And I think one of the things with pesticides is, they're safe until they're proven not to be safe, and unfortunately they're used that way round, rather than they're not allowed to be used until they're proven to be safe, which is what it should be the way round it is. And we've seen this over and over again with pesticides, that it's safe until it isn't, and then it's taken out, and then something else comes along. Well, it's safe until it isn't, and so on and so on.
Which is the interesting bit, isn't it? And from what I understand from listening to this, that although they're individually related and the risks are highlighted, actually don't know enough about how they interact with each other. I think you've called this cocktail effect in the past.
Absolutely, because so individual pesticides are regulated individually, one at a time, to look at. But that, of course, is not the reality. I've already mentioned the apple with 14 different pesticide residues on it. So we are being exposed to a cocktail of pesticides in the food that we eat, the air we breathe, the water we drink, etc., etc. And we don't know. We actually don't know. There has been some research to show that, yes, there are synergistic effects whereby two pesticides together can heighten or increase the effects of the negative effects of one of them. And I understand this is given the potentially millions and millions of combinations, it is a very complicated area, and there's no denying that, and that is what several of our regulatory authorities said, well, it's really complicated, so we won't bother with it, which is not good enough. And so the best way to, again, until we understand this more fully, is to ensure that actually maybe we're not eating multiple pesticide residues, and that would mean reducing our pesticide use. So I think we all learned a few years ago that actually prevention is probably better than a cure as well. And so taking those preventative measures would probably be the sensible option. Because, as I say, we don't know. We suspect, and research has shown that this could definitely be the case, but it's not widely understood. And just on that as well, there's particularly with endocrine disrupting chemicals, and these aren't just pesticides, there are a wide range of them in general use, but there are a lot of pesticides that are endocrine disruptors. There's been some really interesting research on low dose effects. So the standard thing is very much the old thing, well, the dose makes the poison. The higher the dose, the bigger the poison. But actually it seems in some cases, and this again is very early days of research, that actually the lower the dose, the greater the impact, because it has these impacts on the hormone system.
Wow.
Again, so it sort of flies in the face of conventional sort of, if you like, toxicological wisdom. But there are studies out there that are showing in some cases, particularly with the endocrine system, that the lower the dose, the bigger the impact. And I'm not a medical expert, so I can't really unpack that anymore. But again, it's that, well, we don't know about it, so let's just carry on as normal, rather than, well, let's try and take these things out of use until we do understand things. So it's that reversal of prevention. Or anyway,
the approach that we take to it, isn't it, is the challenge.
It's not the precautionary approach, which is what we should be doing.
Of course, I'm listening to you, Nick, and now this is basically the House of Horrors, because if I think about, what motivates people like me, who love food, we're foodies, we're super foodies, we're so fussy about what we put in our mouth, what we swallow, what we eat, and then there's all these things hidden in view that are in what we eat and drink that are effectively poisonous. So I think now is a good time to segue into what we can actually do. So let's talk a little bit about the Dirty Dozen for a start, because that's a great piece of work, isn't it?
Okay, so the UK government tests food that's available for the public to buy from supermarkets, markets, etc. every year. It's quite limited in scope, but we take their data and we look at it in terms of the presence of multiple pesticide residues on the types of fruit and vegetables in particular that they test. We then publish that as a ranking, so from worst, I suppose, to best, and publish that. And the idea is that it allows the UK consumer to make informed choices about the fruit and vegetables that they are buying for themselves and their family, etc., in terms of pesticide residues. And the idea is not to frighten people. It's to give them information that we believe they're absolutely entitled to, because people should know what is on the food that they eat. And then they can, for example, look at it and think, well, I eat a lot of grapes, or I feed a lot of grapes to my children. They are quite bad, generally, in terms of presence of pesticide residue, so maybe I'll buy organic grapes instead, which won't have pesticide residues on. So, as I say, it's about allowing the public to make informed decisions about the food that they buy and the food that they put on their plates.
And I find it very, very useful. You publish them every year, don't you?
Yes, we do.
Are there some routine offenders that we should know about?
Yeah, I mean, citrus fruits, soft citrus, or grapefruit is one of the only things that has almost 100% multiple residues on everything that's tested.
Wow.
Citrus in particular. A lot of that is applied to the skin outside, again, to protect it from going off in, when it's transported. But, people do use the zest quite often. But it will also find its way inside. And, so citrus, things like apples, pears, often bad. Some of the soft fruits, strawberries, a lot of it's fruit, but then we do get things like spinach and salads and that sort of thing. So the thing is, different things are tested every year. So you'll see different things in the results every year. Again, it's not meant to be a definitive, and it can't be a definitive because of the lack of data, but it's just to give people an idea about what's going on. But we hope that then spurs the public into taking some kind of action.
Nick, we got briefly cut off, didn't we? So we're back now, and I want to ask you about grains. I've heard that oats are particularly bad for being sprayed with pesticides as they're drying. Is that right?
Well, so when we talk about grains, let's talk about cereals as a whole. So wheat, barley, oats, etc. Yes, they can be. They are particularly bad, and in particular, the presence of glyphosate residues in both sort of flours made from grains, but also in the final product, so bread products, etc. I think part of this can be put down to the massive increase in the use of glyphosate. So in cereals in particular, and I stress this is probably an underestimate, glyphosate usage in the last 20 years in the UK on cereals has increased by about 700%. And, we're not growing 700% more cereals than we were. This is an increase on basically the same amount. So glyphosate in particular is used as a pre-harvest desiccant, so it's used to dry crops before they're harvested because it makes it easier for the sort of the technological ways we're doing things, but also I think glyphosate use has just increased generally. And of course the resulting problem is residues in the food that we then eat. So we've looked at some of the government data over the years, and sort of 50% of bread products have glyphosate and other pesticide residues present in them. So yeah, it is a concern. And yes, it is this overuse that is leading to this. And I would also say that the presence of glyphosate in cereals in particular, and this includes things that are used to make breakfast cereals as well. So there have been a lot of studies in the US where glyphosate residues are turning up in your Cheerios for your breakfast cereal and that sort of thing. And actually, that presence has led to, in many ways, to this huge public concern about the use of glyphosate in general.
That all makes sense. And in fact, I've just been thinking in my head while you're talking that I bake a loaf of bread every week. And my kids have cereal all the time. Porridge particularly, is like quite a common breakfast for us. And it's making me wonder, what can we actually do at home? Organic, of course, is much more regulated in terms of fewer pesticides. Do you have any tips for us?
Yeah, I mean, obviously organic is the best way to reduce or eliminate your exposure to pesticide residues. And there are some great organic porridge oats available. Definitely. But it comes to this issue of cost, and for many 100% organic diet is just not going to be a reality. So back to our Dirty Dozen that we publish, that shows the regular worst offenders, or what is likely to have multiple pesticide residues present in it. And I think you can use that as a guide, so that if you eat a lot of grapes, for example, you may want to just switch to organic grapes. So looking at the things that you eat most of, that are most likely to be contaminated with pesticides, or the things that your children eat most of, switching those to organic, rather than going, completely organic, may well, help you reduce your exposure to pesticide residues.
That's incredibly useful. And I suppose instinctively, that's perhaps what I have been doing, just reaching for organic apples on the back of your dirty dozen. What about this fruit washing business? Because I did write about it. There's, I believe, like a bicarb solution you can use. I mean, it gives me a headache. What do you think? Does it actually work?
No. I mean, obviously wash your carrots and things that are covered in mud, because there are all sorts of things potentially in those. But in terms of pesticide residues, washing and peeling probably won't get rid of things, because many of the pesticides that are used today are systemic, which means they go up through the entirety of the plant and the fruit or vegetable or whatever is produced from them. It's certainly no guarantee. And of course, the problem with pesticide residues is you can't see them, you can't smell them, you can't taste them. You don't know whether they're there, and subsequently you don't know whether you've got rid of them. Perhaps not using the zest on non-organic citrus fruits is good, because a lot of what is applied is to the outside, but then people still use the zest. You're still touching them and coming into contact with them. So the washing thing, the bicarb thing, it's not really going to have an impact necessarily.
And that's so just relieving to hear, to be honest, Nick, because it's, we are time poor and we are cash poor. It's not feasible or practical to be expected to wash vegetables. And I suppose the more we're aware of this sort of thing, the more we can reach for the right products and actually support the brands and the producers that are doing the right thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not scaremongering about this. We're not saying that you eat a carrot with multiple pesticide residues on, you're going to get XYZ health outcome. We're not saying that at all, and we certainly don't want people to stop eating fruit and vegetables as part of a healthy, balanced and interesting diet. But yes, we should be telling the people where we get our food from. Probably most relevant to the big supermarkets and retailers, that we don't want pesticides being used. We don't want them ending up as residues, but also, and perhaps more importantly, we don't want the pesticides that are being used to grow our food to poison those people that are growing our food. And actually, the impacts of exposure to pesticides are more felt by the people working with them, the people that are growing their food, often in the global south, where we see thousands and thousands of people hospitalised or dying each year from their exposure to pesticides. So the message should be, we want you to address the use of pesticides throughout your global supply chain, so they're not poisoning the workers, they're not poisoning the environment, and they're not ending up as residues in the food that we eat. And supermarkets will listen. They will listen to their public. They will listen to their consumers. So, people have the power to force positive change. And if people do want to learn more about what sort of the 10 biggest retailers in the UK are doing, they can come and have a look at the Pan UK supermarket web pages and see that actually some of them are doing some good stuff throughout their global supply chain, certainly doing more than is legally required, looking at taking out toxic pesticides or phasing out the use of paraquat, which is a particularly harmful herbicide. So have a look at those pages, and in conjunction with our sort of dirty dozen, to get a more informed picture of what's going on, but also some ideas of what you can do as an individual. And I think the last thing on that, if you can, buy locally from people that you know. And eat seasonally, because local and seasonal is less likely to have pesticide residues on, and eat organic where you possibly can.
I was going to ask you what gives you hope, but I think that's a very hopeful end to this conversation. I mean, we do what we can. And for anyone watching or listening, I'm going to put in the show notes the link that Nick talks about. So do please get involved in the Dirty Dozen and use it as a way forward. And Nick, thank you so much for coming along and sharing your wisdom.
It's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I hope it hasn't been too terrifying, and yes, do carry on eating fruit and vegetables.
We definitely will, don't you worry. Thank you very much, and see you very soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Guys, if you've enjoyed listening and learning from this, please don't forget to subscribe, tell all your friends about us, and remember, you can get this podcast on YouTube, Apple, and Spotify. Thank you for joining. See you next time.